Imagine standing on Paris's stone walls, staring at the Seine. The water should be there, grey, cold, moving. But today it's gone, buried under the hulls of 700 Viking longships, dragon heads packed so tight the river itself disappears. The emperor is hundreds of miles away. You have barely 200 men. And the Northmen didn't come to raid a church and leave. They came to erase Paris. Let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Sit back and enjoy the story. If you think you know the Vikings, you probably picture them running onto a beach, axes swinging, grabbing gold from a monastery, and vanishing before the local lords could saddle their horses. That is the popular image, the lightning strike, the hit and run. But that image is incomplete. It ignores the terrifying evolution of the Norse war machine. By the late 9th century, the Vikings had ceased to be mere pirates. They had become conquerors. They had become engineers. And nowhere was this terrifying transformation more evident and more lethal than on a cold morning in November 885 AD. To understand the sheer magnitude of what happened at Paris, we first have to strip away our modern view of the city. Forget the Eiffel Tower. Forget the sprawling metropolis of romance. In the 9th century, Paris was not the capital of France. France didn't even exist yet. The region was West Francia, a fractured shard of Charlemagne's once great empire. Paris itself was effectively a small fortified island locked in the middle of the Seine River, the Ile de la Cité. It was a diamond-shaped fortress connected to the riverbanks by 2 fortified bridges. It was a strategic choke point. If you controlled Paris, you controlled the river. If you controlled the river, you controlled the flow of food, wealth, and trade for the entire region. For decades, the Frankish rulers had tried to pay the Vikings to go away. It was a policy called Danegeld, gold for peace. It was a humiliating tax that drained the kingdom's coffers but kept the cities from burning. But in 885, a new generation of Viking warlords decided that gold wasn't enough. They didn't just want the rent. They wanted the house. The primary source for this event is a monk named Abbo Cernuus, or Abbo the Crooked. He was there. He stood on the walls. And in his writings, you don't just read history, you feel the vibration of sheer panic. Abbo describes the arrival of the great heathen army not as a military maneuver, but as a force of nature. On November 24th, the bells of the Parisian churches began to ring, not for prayer, but in desperation. The scouts had returned with news that seemed impossible. The Northmen were coming. But not in 10 ships, not in 20. The fleet was led by the legendary chieftain Siegfried, and ostensibly the towering figure of Rollo, the man who would one day found Normandy. When the prow of the first Viking longship sliced through the mist of the Seine, the defenders on the Grand Pont Bridge tightened their grip on their spears. Then came the second, then the 10th, then the 100th. Abbo wrote that the ships were so numerous that the river was not seen for the space of 2 leagues. A league is roughly 3 miles. Imagine 6 miles of river completely paved over by the hulls of oak ships. The forests of the north had been cut down and reshaped into a weapon pointed directly at the heart of Christendom. But as the fleet dropped anchor, bringing the flow of the Seine to a standstill, the defenders noticed something disturbing among the standard troop transports and dragon-prowed warships. There were heavy barges. There were platforms. There were massive piles of timber that looked like construction materials. The Vikings were building something. This is the story of the Siege of Paris. But it is not just a story of swords and shields. It is a story of medieval engineering warfare. It is the story of how a band of pagan warriors, often dismissed as savages by their Christian enemies, utilized advanced siege technology, battering rams, catapults, and the terrifying floating towers to crack open a city that refused to die. We are going to walk through the 12 months of hell that followed. We will analyze the tactical genius of the Viking warlord Siegfried, who treated the siege like a chess match. We will look at the impossible resilience of Count Odo of Paris, a man who had only 200 professional soldiers to defend against an army of 30,000. We will dissect the mechanics of the machines that tore down the Roman-era walls. This was the moment the Vikings proved they could go toe-to-toe with the greatest fortifications in Europe. They didn't just bring axes, they brought the apocalypse. And for the people trapped on that island in the Seine, the world was about to end. Welcome to the Siege of Paris. To understand why a fleet of 700 ships was able to sail deep into the heart of France without being stopped, we must look away from the river for a moment and look at the throne. The year 885 AD falls into a period historians often refer to as the Carolingian Twilight. Less than a century earlier, Charlemagne had forged a massive European empire, uniting vast territories under the banner of Christianity and the sword of the Franks. He was a terrifying figure to the pagan north, a king who waged ruthless wars against the Saxons and projected power that kept the Vikings at bay. But by 885, Charlemagne was long dead, and his empire was rotting from the inside out. The crown now rested on the head of his great-grandson, Emperor Charles the Fat. It is perhaps one of the most unfortunate epithets in history, though it likely referred to his lethargy rather than his waistline. Charles was a man wholly unsuited for the brutal realities of the 9th century. He was sickly, prone to illness, and possibly suffered from epilepsy. But more damaging than his physical health was his political weakness. Technically, Charles the Fat had achieved the impossible. Through a series of deaths among his cousins and brothers, he had reunited Charlemagne's fragmented empire. He was the sole ruler of East Francia, West Francia, and Italy. On paper, he was the most powerful man in the Western world. In reality, he was a ghost. He was often absent, ruling from distant palaces in Germany, disconnected from the plight of the people in the West. He viewed the Vikings not as an existential threat to be destroyed, but as a nuisance to be managed. His preferred tactic was not steel, but silver. He paid them to leave. He paid them to attack his rivals. He treated the Northmen like mercenaries, failing to realize that you cannot buy loyalty from a wolf. You can only buy time. This weakness created a vacuum. The Vikings, sharp tacticians that they were, smelled blood in the water. They knew the centralized defense of the empire had collapsed. There was no standing imperial army ready to march to the coast. Every city was on its own, and the prize was Paris. We need to clarify exactly what Paris was in 885 AD, because it looked nothing like the city we know today. There were no sprawling boulevards, no Louvre, no Champs-Élysées. The city had contracted in self-defense. It had retreated almost entirely onto the Île de la Cité, a natural island sitting in the middle of the Seine. This geography is the single most important factor in the siege. The island was shaped like a massive ship made of stone and earth, anchored in the current. It was surrounded by Roman-era walls that had been hastily repaired and reinforced with masonry from ruined churches. It was a fortress. But it wasn't just a fortress, it was a dam. The Ile de la Cité was connected to the riverbanks by 2 bridges. To the north, connecting to the right bank, was the Grand Pont, the Great Bridge. To the south, connecting to the left bank, was the Petit Pont, the small bridge. These weren't delicate wooden crossings, they were fortified structures, guarded by stone towers at their bridgeheads. Crucially, these bridges were built low to the water and on heavy pilings. This meant that no ship, not even the shallow draft Viking longships, could pass underneath them. If you wanted to sail up the Seine to raid the wealthy, untouched lands of Burgundy in the east, you had to go through Paris. You couldn't go around it. For decades, the Vikings had simply demanded a toll. They would arrive, threaten to burn the suburbs, and the Frankish kings would pay them Darngeld to let them pass or to go away. In 845, the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, according to the sagas, had supposedly raided the city, leaving only after being paid 7,000 livres of silver and gold. The memory of that humiliation was burned into the psyche of the Parisians. They knew that when the dragon ships appeared, the king would open the treasury and the city would be spared. But 885 was different. The Vikings who arrived under Siegfried and Rollo weren't interested in a quick payout. They had realized that the constant payments were finite. Why take a slice of the pie when the empire was too weak to stop you from taking the whole bakery? Siegfried knew that if he could break the bridges of Paris, the entire river system of France would belong to him. The strategy was sound. The timing was perfect. The emperor was hundreds of miles away in Italy and Germany, dealing with his own internal rebellions. Paris was isolated. However, the Vikings made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the city was the same soft target it had been 40 years prior. They didn't account for the fact that while the emperor was weak, the local lords had become hard. The defences of Paris had been overhauled. The bridges had been turned into choke points. The towers guarding the bridgeheads, specifically the Grand Châtelet on the right bank and the Petit Châtelet on the left, were engineered to rain death upon anyone attempting to dismantle the bridge supports. The river, which had always been the Vikings' highway, was about to become their trap. When the massive fleet arrived, the sheer scale of the invasion force would have been enough to make most cities surrender immediately. 30,000 to 40,000 Vikings. To put that in perspective, a large Frankish field army might number 5,000 men. The Vikings outnumbered the entire military capacity of the region. But before the first arrow was fired, there was an attempt at diplomacy. It is a scene that perfectly illustrates the clash of cultures and the shifting tides of power. Siegfried, the Viking king, requested a meeting with the leaders of Paris. He didn't demand gold this time. He made a surprisingly simple offer. He asked for free passage. "Open the bridges," he essentially said. "Let us sail through to Burgundy. We will not harm your city. We will not burn your homes. We just want to pass." It was a tempting offer. If the Parisians agreed, they would survive. They would watch the fleet sail by, and the war would be someone else's problem. It was exactly the kind of deal Charles the Fat would have taken in a heartbeat. But the men standing on the walls of Paris were not Charles the Fat. They looked at the endless sea of ships. They looked at the peaceful request, and they realized that allowing this force to penetrate the interior of the country would mean the end of the kingdom. They chose to be the shield. This decision turned a raiding expedition into the most significant siege of the Viking Age. The Vikings were stuck. They couldn't go forward because of the bridges. They couldn't go back because of their pride and the promise of plunder. They had to destroy the obstruction. The stage was set. The geography dictated the terms of the battle. The Vikings, masters of open-field mobility and naval skirmishes, were forced into a grinding, static siege warfare against stone walls. This was not the fight they were used to. To win, they would have to stop thinking like pirates and start thinking like engineers. They would have to build machines that defied the water itself. But first, they would try to take the city by storm. History is often described as the movement of nations, the shifting of borders, and the collision of economies. But when you zoom in, when you strip away the maps and the dates, history ultimately comes down to people. It comes down to staring contests between men who refuse to blink. The Siege of Paris was not just a battle of wood and stone. It was a duel of wills between 4 specific individuals. On one side, the wolves of the north, seeking to devour the world. On the other, the lions of Paris, cornered but dangerous. To understand the ferocity of the coming battle, we must meet the architects of the slaughter. Leading the great heathen army was a man named Siegfried. In the chronicles, he is often overshadowed by more famous Viking names like Ragnar or Ivar the Boneless. But Siegfried was a different breed of warlord. He wasn't just a berserker, he was a politician. He was a king of the Danes, a man who understood leverage as well as he understood the axe. He had spent years raiding the fringes of the Frankish Empire, testing its weaknesses, taking its gold, and learning its language. Siegfried represents the evolution of the Viking threat. Early raids were chaotic, hit-and-run attacks led by local chieftains. Siegfried commanded a coalition. To hold together an army of diverse warbands, comprised of Danes, Norwegians, and mercenaries, required a charisma and a strategic mind that went far beyond simple bloodlust. He was the brain of the operation. But if Siegfried was the brain, the muscle was a man whose name echoes through history louder than almost any other Viking: Rollo. Rollo is a figure so large he almost breaks the historical record. The sagas call him Gungu Hrolfr, or Rollo the Walker. The legend says he was so physically massive, so tall and broad, that the small Norse horses of the time couldn't carry him. He was forced to walk into battle, towering over his peers. While Siegfried planned the logistics, Rollo was the force of nature. He was the tip of the spear. Rollo's presence at Paris is crucial because he represents the future. He wasn't just looking for loot, he was looking for land. He was looking for a legacy. This was a man who would eventually force the French king to give him the territory we now call Normandy, land of the Northmen. But in 885 he was still a hungry predator, standing on the deck of his ship, looking at the stone walls of Paris as an obstacle to his destiny. Together, Siegfried and Rollo commanded a force that the monk Abbo claims numbered 40,000 men and 700 ships. Even if we account for medieval exaggeration and cut that number in half, it was still a force capable of conquering a kingdom. Facing this tidal wave of steel were 2 men who, by all rights, should have fled the moment the sails appeared on the horizon. The military command of Paris fell to Count Odo, or Eudes. He was young, likely in his mid-20s, and he carried a heavy burden. His father was Robert the Strong, a legendary figure who had died fighting the Vikings years earlier. Odo had vengeance in his blood. He was not a king, he was a count, a nobleman elected by his peers to hold the line because the emperor was absent. Odo represents the shift in European power that was happening in the 9th century. The central kings were weak, distant, and ineffective. The local lords, the men actually standing on the walls, bleeding for their people, were the new power. Odo was charismatic, physically brave, and possessed a tactical brilliance that allowed him to see the siege not as a hopeless stand, but as a solvable problem. He knew he couldn't defeat the Viking army in the open field. His only chance was to turn Paris into a meat grinder. Standing beside Odo was perhaps the most fascinating character of the entire siege, Bishop Goslin. In the modern world, we think of bishops as religious figures, men of peace, sermons, and prayer. Goslin was not that kind of bishop. He was a prince of the church in the most medieval sense. He was an administrator, a financier, and a warrior. Before the Vikings arrived, it was Goslin who had overseen the reinforcement of the walls. It was Goslin who emptied the church treasuries to buy weapons and armour. He understood that prayers alone would not stop a Danish axe. Abbo describes Goslin as a man who wielded both the cross and the bow. He is a testament to the desperate reality of the time. When the apocalypse comes, everyone fights. The distinction between priest and soldier evaporated when the longships hit the water. The disparity between these two forces is hard to comprehend. Abbo gives us a specific number for the defenders. He claims that inside the tower guarding the Grand Pont, there were only 200 men-at-arms. 200 against 30,000. Even if we assume there were civilian levies, archers, and militia supporting them, the core professional fighting force of Paris was microscopic compared to the Viking horde. It was a 300 Spartans scenario playing out on the banks of the Seine. The tension broke the day after the fleet arrived. Siegfried, ever the pragmatist, requested a parley. He didn't want a siege. Sieges were long, expensive, and disease-ridden. He wanted to move past Paris to the rich, undefended lands of Burgundy. The meeting took place, likely, at the fortified bridgehead. Siegfried stood face to face with Bishop Goslin. The conversation, recorded by Abbo, is a chilling exchange of philosophy. Siegfried made his offer. Goslin, have compassion on yourself and your flock. We do not ask for your lives. We do not ask for your city. We only ask that you let us pass. Open the bridges. If you do this, we will preserve the city and your property as if it were our own. It was a seductive lie. Or perhaps it was the truth. It didn't matter. To let the Vikings pass would be to unleash them on the rest of the innocent population upstream. It would be an act of cowardice that Goslin could not stomach. Goslin's response is one of the great speeches of defiance in medieval history. He looked the Viking king in the eye and said, "This city has been entrusted to us by our king, Charles, to hold and to protect, not to betray. If the defence of these walls had been entrusted to you, and you had done what you ask me to do, what would you think of yourself?" Siegfried, perhaps respecting the bishop's honour, but bound by his own ambition, replied simply, "If I did that, I would deserve to be slain, and my head thrown to the dogs. But listen to me, Bishop. My army is hungry. If you do not yield, we will take this city. Our swords will not rest until the sun rises over a ruin. And when we are done, we will negotiate with the dead." The diplomacy was over. Siegfried returned to his ships. Goslin returned to the cathedral to pray, and then to the armory to equip himself for war. The Vikings realized that the easy way was off the table. They couldn't bypass the bridges, they had to destroy them. The massive fleet began to move. The drums started beating. The psychological warfare had failed, and now the physical warfare would begin. For the 200 men in the tower, looking out at the ocean of enemies, the reality set in. There was no retreat. There was no emperor coming to save them. There was only the stone beneath their feet and the steel in their hands. The wolf had howled. Now the lion had to bite back. The diplomacy had failed. The sun set on November 25th, 885, over a city holding its breath. The silence that night was heavy, broken only by the sounds of the immense Viking host preparing for war on the riverbanks, the sharpening of iron, the chanting of prayers to Odin and Thor, the rhythmic thud of axes testing shield wood. The following morning, November 26th, the sun didn't rise, it was eclipsed. Abel Cernuus describes the beginning of the assault not as a military maneuver, but as a meteorological event, a storm of arrows so dense that it darkened the sky. The Vikings didn't probe the defences, they tried to smash them instantly. Siegfried directed his fury at a specific point. He was a tactician, and he had spotted a weakness. The tower guarding the Grand Pont on the right bank, the structure known as the Grand Châtelet, was unfinished. The stone walls were only partially built, with the upper sections completed hastily with timber and wood. It was the Achilles heel of Paris. If the Vikings could burn or breach this tower, the bridge would fall and the river would be theirs. The assault began with a roar that shook the foundations of the island. Thousands of Vikings surged off the ships and onto the banks. They didn't march in formation, they flooded the ground. They carried scaling ladders, pickaxes to dig through the walls, and torches. Their objective was simple: overwhelm the defenders with sheer biomass. Inside the tower, Count Odo and Bishop Goslin stood with their 200 men. This is where the numbers game became a terrifying reality. Each Frankish soldier was effectively fighting 100 Vikings. If they tired, if they slipped, if they hesitated for a second, the city would fall. But the Vikings had made a fatal assumption. They assumed the Franks would be cowering behind their shields. They didn't expect the Franks to have artillery. As the first wave of Vikings rushed the walls, screaming for blood, the air was suddenly filled with a different sound, a deep, resonant thrum. The Franks unleashed the ballistae. These were massive, torsion-powered siege crossbows mounted on the tower walls. They fired heavy iron bolts, thick as a man's arm, with enough kinetic energy to punch through a shield, through the man holding it, and through the man standing behind him. Abbo describes the horrific efficiency of these weapons. Vikings were skewered in lines, pinned to the ground like insects. It was a shock to the Northmen. They were used to fighting enemies who ran away or fought in shield walls. They were not used to being engaged at range by heavy machinery. But the sheer number of Vikings meant they couldn't be stopped by bolts alone. They reached the base of the tower. They threw up their ladders. They began hacking at the wooden foundations with axes, trying to topple the structure. the fighting shifted from long-range bombardment to a brutal vertical melee. This is where the reality of medieval siege warfare becomes nightmarish. It wasn't glorious duels, it was industrial slaughter. As the Vikings clawed their way up the ladders, the Franks deployed their second weapon, liquid fire. In the kitchens and workshops of the Ile de la Cité, the defenders had been boiling great cauldrons of oil, pitch, and wax. This mixture was a terrifying weapon. When poured from the ramparts, it didn't just burn, it stuck. It seeped through the chainmail links, cooking the flesh beneath the armour. Abbo's account is graphic. He describes the Vikings screaming as the boiling wax glued their hair to their scalps and the hot oil transformed their leather armour into ovens. The invincible berserkers, who claimed to feel no pain, were broken by the agony of thermal warfare. They fell from the ladders, their bodies smoking, creating a grisly pile of dead and dying at the base of the tower. And yet they kept coming. For hours the assault raged. It was a contest of endurance. The Vikings were rotated out, fresh warriors replacing the tired, keeping the pressure constant. The Franks had no such luxury. The same 200 men had to swing their swords, load the ballistae, and pour the oil without rest. Bishop Goslin, the man of God, was in the thick of it. Legend says he planted a cross on the ramparts and fought with a bow, blessing the defenders and cursing the attackers in the same breath. Count Odo was everywhere, patching holes in the defence, shoving ladders off the walls, his presence acting as a morale anchor. They knew that if the tower fell, the bridge fell. If the bridge fell, Paris was gone. By sunset, the ground around the Grand Châtelet was a swamp of mud and blood. The Vikings, exhausted and demoralized by the unexpected ferocity of the defence, finally sounded the retreat. They pulled back to their ships, carrying their wounded. The Franks had won the day. But the victory was Pyrrhic. They were exhausted, their supplies were depleted, and the tower was damaged. That night there was no celebration in Paris. There was only the sound of hammers. The defenders knew the Vikings would return at dawn, and they had to rebuild the shattered sections of the tower overnight. They worked through the darkness, adding another story of wood to the tower to make it even higher, reinforcing the gates and restocking the piles of stones and oil. When the sun rose on the second day, Siegfried was furious. He had lost hundreds of men for nothing. He ordered a second assault, even more ferocious than the first. This time, the Vikings tried to undermine the tower. They brought up miners to dig at the foundations, protected by shield walls. But the Franks had learned. They rained down not just arrows, but massive stones, crushing the miners in their trenches. The ballistae sang their deadly song again and again. At one point, the Vikings managed to set fire to the wooden gate of the tower. The flames licked up the structure, threatening to consume the timber upper story. It seemed like the end. But the wind, perhaps by divine intervention, as Abbo claimed, or simply by luck, shifted. The fire died down. The gate held. After 2 days of relentless bloodshed, Siegfried called a halt. The lesson had been learned in blood. The first blood phase of the siege was over. Siegfried realized that Paris could not be taken by a rush. The walls were too high, the defenders too stubborn, and the choke point too narrow. Throwing bodies at the wall was suicide. The Vikings retreated to their camp. The Franks cheered from the walls, thinking they had broken the enemy's spirit. They were wrong. Siegfried wasn't giving up. He was changing the game. He realized he couldn't fight the Franks on their terms. He needed to change the battlefield. If the walls were too high, he would build machines to reach them. If the river was the Franks' ally, he would turn it against them. The Vikings put down their swords and picked up their axes, not to kill, but to chop wood. The forests around Paris began to fall. The sound of battle was replaced by the sound of construction. The Franks watched from the walls with growing dread. They saw the keels of ships being lashed together. They saw massive beams being hoisted. They saw the shapes of monsters rising from the riverbanks. The assault was over. The engineering war was about to begin. The silence that fell over Paris in January 886 was deceptive. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a workshop. For weeks, the defenders on the walls of the Ile de la Cité heard the rhythmic, maddening sound of axes biting into timber. They saw smoke rising from the Viking camps, not from cooking fires, but from forges. The Northmen had stripped the surrounding countryside of every usable tree. They had dismantled barns, houses, and even their own damaged ships to harvest wood and iron. Siegfried had realized that the walls of Paris were too high to climb and too thick to break with hand tools. If he wanted to take the city, he had to change the laws of physics that governed the battlefield. He had to neutralize the Frankish height advantage. This phase of the siege challenges everything we think we know about the Vikings. Pop culture depicts them as raiders who relied on speed and shock, but at Paris they demonstrated a level of siege engineering that rivaled the Roman legions or the Byzantine armies. They proved that the same mathematical genius that allowed them to build the longship, a vessel capable of crossing the Atlantic, could be repurposed for static warfare. The Vikings became an industrial army, and the machines they built were the stuff of nightmares. First came the bombardment. The Vikings constructed mangonels and catapults. These were not the crude devices of earlier eras, but heavy torsion engines capable of hurling massive stones hundreds of yards. For the first time, the people inside Paris weren't just starving, they were being hunted. Rocks the size of sheep rained down on the houses, crushing roofs and bones alike. The psychological terror was immense. Death could drop from the sky at any moment. But artillery alone wouldn't breach the walls. Siegfried needed to get his men to the stone. To do this, the Viking engineers constructed a fleet of battering rams. But these weren't just logs carried by men. They were sophisticated, roofed vehicles. Abocernus calls them musculi, little mice. They were massive oak sheds on wheels covered in layers of raw animal hides. Why raw hides? Because wet, raw skin doesn't burn. These mice were designed to protect the miners and the ram operators from the boiling oil and fire that had decimated the first assault. The plan was to roll these machines up to the base of the towers where the Vikings could chip away at the mortar in safety, like mice gnawing through a cupboard. The Franks watched these armoured beasts inch closer, immune to their arrows. But the true horror was yet to come. Siegfried knew that as long as the Franks held the high ground, the tops of the towers and walls, his men were at a disadvantage. He needed to look the defenders in the eye. He needed a platform that was higher than the walls of Paris. And so the Vikings built the floating towers. This was the masterstroke of the siege. It was an engineering marvel born of necessity. The Vikings took their massive transport barges, ships designed to carry horses and heavy loot, and lashed them together in groups of 3. This created a stable, incredibly buoyant trimaran base. On top of this floating foundation, they constructed colossal wooden fortresses. These weren't hasty scaffolds. They were multi-story siege towers built with heavy timber framing. They were tall enough to overlook the bridge towers of the Grand Pont and the Petit Pont. Imagine the sight from the defender's perspective. You were standing on a secure stone tower, perhaps 30 feet above the water. You feel safe. And then, slowly, drifting out of the morning mist, comes a wooden skyscraper. It is moving against the current, pulled by ropes and rowers. As it gets closer, you realize that the men standing on the top platform are looking down at you. The psychological impact was devastating. The river, which was supposed to be a moat, had become a highway for castles. The Vikings didn't just build one, they built 3 of these leviathans. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Float the towers up to the bridgeheads. From the high platforms, Viking archers and javelin throwers would suppress the Frankish defenders, raining death down onto the ramparts. Meanwhile, beneath the cover of this aerial assault, the battering rams and miners would attack the base of the bridge towers. It was a combined arms assault, naval, infantry and artillery working in synchronization. On the day of the grand attack, the river Seine became a stage for the apocalypse. The drums beat a slow, terrifying rhythm. The floating towers lurched forward. As they approached the Grand Châtelet, the sheer scale of the machines became apparent. They dwarfed the Viking longships escorting them. The towers were covered in wet hides to prevent fire, giving them a grotesque organic appearance, like giant skin-covered monsters rising from the deep. The engagement began with a deafening exchange of missiles. The Vikings on the towers had the advantage of height and numbers. They unleashed a storm of arrows that pinned the Franks behind their battlements. For the first time, Count Odo and Bishop Goslin found themselves suppressed. They couldn't lean over the walls to pour oil without getting a faceful of iron. Under the shadow of the floating towers, the Viking mice, the covered rams, surged forward. They slammed into the gates of the Grand Châtelet. Boom! 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 The sound echoed through the entire city. The mortar began to crack. The stone began to groan. To make matters worse, the Vikings began filling the ditch around the tower. They threw in bundles of sticks, earth, and even the bodies of dead animals, and some sources suggest dead prisoners, to create a ramp. They were literally paving the way for a total breach. The situation inside the Grand Châtelet was critical. The walls were shaking. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded and the splintering of wood. The floating towers were so close that the Vikings were trying to lower boarding ramps onto the Frankish battlements. It was ship-to-ship combat, but one ship was made of stone and the other of wood. Siegfried watched from the riverbank, confident. His engineering gamble was paying off. The combination of the floating towers suppressing the top and the rams destroying the bottom seemed unstoppable. The mathematics of war were on his side. But he had forgotten one variable. Engineering works both ways. The Franks were not just warriors. They were the inheritors of Roman military tradition. Bishop Goslin and Count Odo had not been idle while the Vikings built their machines. They had been preparing a countermeasure. as the floating towers ground against the bridge piers and the Vikings prepared to swarm over the walls, the gates of the Grand Châtelet did not break. Instead, the Franks unleashed their own surprise. They had modified their mangonels. Instead of firing solid stones meant to crush, they loaded them with something else, something lighter, something that could carry a flame. And on the riverbanks, hidden from view, the Franks had been preparing ships of their own, not to fight, but to die. The Viking towers were magnificent feats of engineering, yes, but they were made of wood. They were covered in tar to waterproof them. They were filled with men wearing fur and leather. They were, in essence, the largest floating piles of kindling in the history of France. Siegfried's technological marvels were about to meet the oldest weapon in the world. The engineering dominance of the Vikings had pushed the Franks to the brink, forcing them to resort to a tactic of pure desperation. The battle of the machines was about to turn into an inferno. The laws of warfare are cruel. Often the side that wins isn't the one with the best soldiers, or even the best technology. It is the side that is willing to destroy everything to survive. By late January, the Vikings had the upper hand. Their floating towers were looming over the Grand Pont like gallows. Their battering rams were chewing through the foundations of the Châtelet. The Franks were exhausted, bleeding, and running out of hope. They had thrown rocks, they had thrown spears, and they had thrown insults. Nothing had stopped the industrial advance of Siegfried's war machine. Count Odo and Bishop Goslin realized they had one card left to play. It was a card of absolute desperation. If they couldn't push the Vikings back, they would have to burn them out. But to do so, they would have to risk their own wooden bridges and their own city. The order was given in secret. Under the cover of the stone walls, the defenders began to assemble a different kind of fleet. They took their own transport barges, precious boats that were needed for fishing and moving supplies, and they gutted them. They didn't load these boats with soldiers. They loaded them with the fuel of hell. Barrels of dried pork fat, bundles of straw soaked in pitch, old timber drenched in resin. They created floating bombs. But the Franks added a horrific innovation to these fire ships. They didn't just want them to burn, they wanted them to stick. They loaded the vessels with heavy iron chains and hooks, dragging from the sides. The idea was simple and terrifying. When these ships collided with the Viking fleet, the hooks would snag the enemy riggings, locking the victim and the arsonist together in a fatal embrace. The attack was launched at night. The Vikings were resting on their floating towers and ships, confident in their blockade. The river was calm. Then, from the direction of the city, a glow appeared. It wasn't the sun. It was moving too fast. 3 large barges, engulfed in flames that shot 30 feet into the air, came drifting down the current. Abbo Cernus describes the scene with apocalyptic awe. The fire ships illuminated the night like a second noon. The heat was so intense that the defenders on the walls could feel it on their faces hundreds of yards away. For the Vikings on the floating towers, the sight was paralyzing. These men were trapped on wooden platforms in the middle of a river. They were wearing heavy mail. They had nowhere to go. The current of the Seine, which the Vikings had used to transport their towers, now betrayed them. It carried the fire ships directly into the heart of the blockade. The impact was catastrophic. The first fire ship slammed into the base of the largest floating tower. The iron hooks dug into the timber. The fire didn't hesitate. It leaped from the barge to the tower with a roar that drowned out the screams of the men. The wet hides that the Vikings had meticulously draped over their machines to prevent this exact scenario steam-cooked in seconds, then dried, then caught fire. The floating tower became a chimney. The flames rushed upward, consuming the structure from the waterline to the top platform. The Vikings stationed on top faced a gruesome choice: burn to death or jump into the freezing black water of the Seine in full armour. Most jumped. Few surfaced. The weight of their chainmail dragged them down into the silt, drowning them within sight of the surface. The chaos spread instantly. The fire ships didn't just hit the towers. They drifted into the bridge of ships the Vikings had constructed to block the river. Panic took hold. Viking captains cut their anchor ropes, letting their ships drift downstream to escape the inferno. The meticulously ordered blockade disintegrated into a terrified scramble for survival. From the walls of the Grand Châtelet, the Franks cheered. It was a primal sound, the release of weeks of terror. They watched as the engineering marvels of the north, the towers that had taken months to build, collapsed into the river in a hiss of steam and sparks. The destruction was total. By morning, the floating towers were gone. The battering rams were reduced to charcoal skeletons. The river was choked with debris and the bodies of drowned Norsemen. Siegfried stood on the bank, his face illuminated by the dying embers of his fleet. He had lost hundreds of men. He had lost his siege engines. He had lost the momentum. But the cost of this victory for the Franks was psychological as much as it was physical. They had survived, yes, but they looked out at the Viking camp and saw something terrifying. The Vikings weren't leaving. In a normal raid, a defeat like this would send the Northmen back to Scandinavia. But this wasn't a raid. Siegfried simply reorganized his lines. If he couldn't take the city by force, and he couldn't take it by engineering, he would take it by time. The siege shifted gears. It moved from the frenetic, high-energy combat of the assault to the slow, grinding misery of a blockade. This is the phase of the siege that breaks men's minds. The adrenaline of combat fades, replaced by the gnawing ache of hunger. The Vikings established a permanent perimeter. They controlled the countryside. No food was getting into Paris. Inside the walls, the glory of the fireship attack faded quickly. The reality of their situation set in. They were trapped on an island with thousands of mouths to feed. Abbo writes about the creeping horror of the blockade. The bread ran out, then the meat, then the horses. The people of Paris began to look at their leather shoes and belts not as clothing, but as potential soup ingredients. The emotional toll on the leaders was crushing. Bishop Goslin, the warrior priest, began to succumb to the fatigue. He had carried the spiritual and physical weight of the defence for months. The stress was eating him alive. And then nature itself decided to join the war. As winter turned to spring, the Franks hoped for relief. Instead, they got rain. Torrential, unrelenting rain. The Seine, already swollen with the debris of war, began to rise. The river that had protected Paris, the river that had carried the fireships to victory, was about to turn traitor. The Franks watched the water level creep up the stone pilings of the bridges. They prayed for it to stop, but the water kept rising. The pressure on the wooden supports of the Petit Pont, the bridge connecting to the left bank, became immense. The Vikings saw this too. They stopped fighting. They just watched the water. They realized that the river was doing their work for them. On February 6th, 886, a sound like a thunderclap cracked through the city. It wasn't a battering ram. It wasn't a catapult. It was the Petit Pont snapping. The rushing water, choked with debris, finally overwhelmed the supports. The bridge was swept away. And in that moment of catastrophe, a tactical nightmare was created. The collapse of the bridge physically separated the Petit Châtelet, the tower on the left bank, from the city. 12 brave defenders were still inside that tower when the bridge fell. Suddenly, those 12 men were not part of a fortress. They were alone, cut off from help, cut off from food, cut off from retreat. And staring up at them from the mud below were thousands of Vikings who had been waiting for this exact moment. The fireships had saved the city from the towers, but the river had just served up a sacrifice to the enemy. The stage was set for the most heroic and tragic last stand of the entire siege. War is chaos, but it usually follows a logic. You attack, I defend. You move, I counter. But sometimes war is decided by blind, stupid chance. On February 6, 886, the logic of the siege shattered, along with the timber of the Petit Pont. For months, the Seine River had been the moat that kept the Vikings at bay. It was the shield of Paris. But after weeks of unrelenting rain, the shield became a hammer. The river rose higher than anyone could remember. The water churned, brown and violent, smashing debris against the wooden pilings of the bridges. Count Odo stood on the walls of the Île de la Cité, watching the Petit Pont, the bridge connecting the island to the southern bank, tremble. This bridge was a lifeline. It was a fortification. And in an instant, with a groan of snapping oak that sounded like a dying giant, it was gone. The current ripped the central span away, sweeping it downstream. The connection between the city and the south was severed. The tactical disaster was absolute. But the human tragedy was worse. When the bridge collapsed, it didn't just leave a gap. It isolated the Petit Châtelet, the fortified tower on the far bank. Inside that tower were 12 men. History has preserved their names thanks to the monk Abbo. They were not high lords or famous knights. They were ordinary soldiers. Ermenfrid, Hervé, Erland, Odobert, Eric. 12 men who had been assigned the morning watch. 1 minute they were the guardians of the gate, supported by the entire city behind them. The next minute they were castaways on a stone island, surrounded by an ocean of enemies. The Vikings saw the bridge fall. A roar went up from their camp that drowned out the sound of the river. They knew exactly what this meant. The 12 men in the tower were cut off. No reinforcements could reach them. No arrows from the city could cover them effectively. It was a death sentence. Siegfried didn't even have to give the order. The Vikings swarmed. They didn't just attack the tower, they engulfed it. It was like watching ants swarm a dropped piece of sugar. Hundreds, then thousands of Norsemen surrounded the small stone fortification. What followed is one of the most legendary last stands in French history, a moment that rivals the Spartans at Thermopylae, yet remains almost unknown to the wider world. The Vikings demanded surrender. They shouted up to the 12 men, promising them life if they threw down their weapons. The answer from the tower was a volley of arrows. The 12 Franks knew they were dead. There was no illusion of survival, and when death is certain, fear often evaporates, replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. They decided to make the Vikings pay for every inch of stone. The assault was brutal. The Vikings brought up battering rams. They piled firewood against the wooden gate of the tower and set it ablaze. The smoke choked the defenders. The heat was unbearable. But every time the Vikings tried to rush the breach, they were met with spear points and swords. Abbo writes that the 12 men fought like wild boars. They didn't just defend, they taunted. They laughed at the thousands of men trying to kill them. It was a display of psychological dominance that infuriated the Viking chieftains. For an entire day, 12 men held off an army. From the walls of the main city, across the broken gap of the river, the rest of the garrison watched in helpless horror. They could see their comrades fighting. They could see the smoke. But they couldn't help. The river was too wild to cross by boat. They were forced to be spectators to the slaughter of their brothers. Count Odo paced the ramparts, arguably the darkest moment of his command. He had to watch his men die, unable to send even a single arrow to aid them. By sunset, the fire had done its work. The tower was a ruin. The Vikings, frustrated by the delay and the embarrassment of being held back by a dozen men, finally overwhelmed the defences. They broke through the burning debris. The end was not a battle, it was an execution. The 12 defenders were dragged out. They were battered, burned, and exhausted. They were brought before the Viking leaders. Again the offer might have been made, kneel and live. But the defiance remained. The Vikings, enraged by the stubbornness of these Franks, slaughtered them on the spot. They didn't just kill them, they made a spectacle of it, likely to terrorize the watchers on the city walls. Their bodies were thrown into the river, a final insult, denying them a Christian burial. The fall of the Petit Châtelet was a turning point. It didn't break the defences of the main island, but it broke the stalemate. The Vikings now controlled the left bank completely. They could move freely. They had a foothold. But something else happened that day. The sacrifice of the 12 men didn't demoralize the city. It hardened it. Inside Paris, the grief turned into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The defenders realized that there was no negotiation with this enemy. There was no mercy. The Vikings had shown them exactly what surrender looked like. The siege had now dragged on for months. The adrenaline of the initial assaults had faded. The spectacle of the floating towers and fire ships was over. Now, the grim reality of a long-term blockade set in. The Vikings, realizing they still couldn't take the island fortress by storm despite the bridge collapse, decided to strangle the city. They dug in. They patrolled the river. They waited. Inside the walls, the food stores were emptying. The wells were getting low. And with the warm weather of spring came a new enemy, silent and invisible, creeping through the cramped, sewage-filled streets of the Ile de la Cité. It wasn't a Viking axe. It was a microbe. Pestilence. The wrath of nature wasn't finished with Paris yet. It had taken the bridge with water. Now it was coming for the people with disease. And its first target would be the very heart of the resistance. By the spring of 886, the siege of Paris had ceased to be a battle. It had become a prison sentence. The collapse of the Petit Pont and the massacre of the 12 defenders had established a grim status quo. The Vikings controlled the riverbanks, the Franks controlled the island. Neither side could move. The Vikings, realizing that their floating towers and battering rams had failed to crack the stone nut of the city, decided to let nature finish the job. They stopped throwing spears and started counting days. Inside the walls of the Ile de la Cité, the heroism of the first few months was dissolving into the grotesque reality of biological warfare. A city under siege is a closed ecosystem. Paris was crowded with refugees from the surrounding countryside who had fled behind the walls when the Vikings first arrived. The population density was catastrophic. There was no way to dispose of waste. The river, the city's source of water, was choked with the dead bodies of men and animals from the fighting upstream. The air inside Paris became heavy, not with smoke, but with the sickly sweet smell of decay. And then the pestilence arrived. It likely started as dysentery, the bloody flux. It is the unglamorous, humiliating killer of the ancient world. It strips a warrior of his strength, his dignity, and finally his life, without him ever lifting a sword. Men who had stood fearlessly against Viking axes found themselves withering away in their own filth, too weak to stand on the ramparts. The food stores began to vanish. Abbo Cairnus gives us a glimpse into the pantry of a starving city. First, the grain ran out. Then the livestock, the pigs, the cows, the chickens were slaughtered. Then the inhabitants turned to the animals they usually wouldn't eat: dogs, cats, and rats. Finally, they turned to the inanimate. The Parisians began boiling leather to make a glue-like soup. They chewed on shoes, belts, and shield straps, trying to extract any ounce of protein from the cured hide. It was a slow, agonizing starvation that hollowed out the faces of the defenders, turning the brave garrison into an army of ghosts. And then the city lost its heart. Bishop Goslin, the warrior priest who had been the soul of the resistance, fell ill. This was the man who had planted the cross on the ramparts, who had fired arrows alongside his flock, who had refused Siegfried's bribes. The people looked to him as invincible, a man protected by God. But bacteria does not respect rank or piety. The pestilence took hold of the bishop. On April 16, 886, in the damp, crowded quarters of the cathedral, Bishop Goslin died. His death hit the city harder than a battering ram. A silence fell over Paris that was deeper than any defeat in battle. The people felt abandoned. If God allowed their shepherd to die, what hope did the sheep have? The burden of command now fell entirely on the shoulders of Count Odo. He was alone. He looked around at his starving soldiers, his dying city, and the ring of Viking campfires that mocked him every night. He realized that passive defense was no longer an option. If they stayed behind these walls, they would all die. not by the sword, but by the rot. Odo knew there was only one man who could break this siege, the Emperor, Charles the Fat. But Charles was in Germany. He had sent letters, promises, and vague assurances, but no army. Odo realized that a letter was no longer enough. The Emperor needed to look a man in the eye and see the desperation. And so, Count Odo made a decision that would cement his legend. He decided to leave the city. This was a suicide mission. The Vikings had the city completely surrounded. Their scouts patrolled every road. Their ships watched every stretch of river. For the commander of the city to attempt a breakout was madness. If he was caught, he would be tortured and executed, and Paris would fall immediately. But Odo didn't hesitate. Under the cover of a moonless night, he slipped out of the city gates. We don't know the exact details, whether he swam the river or took a small skiff, but somehow the Lion of Paris became a ghost. He slipped past the Viking sentries, moving through the enemy lines like a shadow. He rode hard to the east, driving his horse into the ground until he reached the Emperor's court. The meeting between Odo and Charles the Fat is a study in contrasts. Odo, gaunt, filthy, smelling of siege and death, his eyes burning with urgency. Charles, corpulent, comfortable, surrounded by luxury, hesitant to commit his forces. Odo didn't just ask for help, he demanded it. He described the suffering of the people. He described the death of Goslin. He made it clear that Paris was days away from surrender. Charles, moved by Odo's intensity, or perhaps shamed by his own inaction, finally agreed to move. He promised to gather the imperial army. But as a token of immediate support, he sent a vanguard force under the command of a man named Henry of Saxony. Odo, having secured the promise, did the unthinkable. He didn't stay in the safety of the Emperor's camp. He turned his horse around and rode back to hell. The return journey was even more dangerous. The Vikings knew he was gone. They were watching for him. As Odo approached Paris, he found his path blocked. The Vikings had tightened the noose. What followed was a scene straight out of a heroic epic. Odo didn't sneak back in, he fought his way in. Abbo describes Odo charging the Viking lines, his sword flashing, cutting a path through the surprised besiegers. The defenders on the walls saw their count returning, fighting against overwhelming odds, and a roar went up from the city. The gates opened just enough to let him in, and then slammed shut. Odo was back. He had brought hope. But hope is a dangerous thing if it isn't followed by action. The relief force, led by Henry of Saxony, arrived shortly after. The Parisians crowded the walls, weeping with joy as they saw the banners of the empire appearing on the horizon. They thought their salvation had arrived. But the Vikings were not amateurs. They knew Henry was coming. They set a trap. Henry, eager for glory but lacking caution, rode ahead of his lines to scout the Viking positions. He rode near a concealed pit that the Vikings had dug and covered with branches. His horse fell. Before he could rise, the Vikings were on him. Henry of Saxony, the hope of Paris, was slaughtered before the main battle even began. His army, leaderless and demoralized, halted their advance. The people on the walls watched their salvation die in a ditch. The emotional whiplash was devastating. They had gone from starvation to hope and back to despair in the span of a few hours. The summer of 886 dragged on. The heat made the smell of the city unbearable. The Vikings, emboldened by the death of Henry, renewed their attacks, but Odo held the line. He walked the walls every day, a living skeleton in armour, telling his people to hold on. Just a little longer. The Emperor was coming. The real army was coming. And finally, in October, nearly a year after the first ships had appeared, the ground began to shake. It wasn't the Vikings. It was the heavy cavalry of the Frankish Empire. Charles the Fat had finally arrived. He brought a massive host, an army large enough to crush the Vikings against the walls of Paris and end the threat forever. To the starving defenders, it looked like the end of the nightmare. They prepared to open the gates and join the Emperor in a final glorious charge to wipe the Northmen off the map. But they didn't know Charles. They didn't know that the man leading the rescue wasn't a lion. He wasn't even a wolf. He was a politician who had brought a checkbook to a knife fight. The greatest betrayal in the history of France was about to take place on the hill of Montmartre. October 886 A.D. The leaves on the banks of the Seine were turning gold, matching the colour of the imperial banners appearing on the horizon. For the starving defenders of Paris, the sight was akin to a religious vision. After 11 months of hell, after the fire ships, the bridge collapse, the plague, and the eating of rats, the horizon was finally filled with friends. Emperor Charles the Fat had arrived, and he had not come alone. He brought with him the full might of the Carolingian Empire. It was a coalition army of fierce proportions: Franks, Alemanni, Saxons, Bavarians. Thousands of heavy cavalry, their mail glistening in the autumn sun, lined the heights of Montmartre, the hill that overlooks the city from the north. From the walls of the Ile de la Cité, Count Odo and his skeleton crew of survivors wept. They had done the impossible. They had held the line. They had bought enough time for the hammer of the Empire to swing down. The tactical situation was now reversed. The Vikings, who had been the besiegers, were now the besieged. Siegfried and his Northmen were trapped. They were sandwiched between the impregnable walls of Paris and the massive imperial army on the hill. They were outnumbered, they were exhausted from a year of campaigning, and they were far from home. It was a checkmate. All Charles the Fat had to do was give the order. One charge, one decisive sweep of heavy cavalry, and the great heathen army would be pinned against the river and annihilated. It would be the greatest victory for Christendom in a century. It would be the end of the Viking threat in France. The Parisians sharpened their swords. They prepared to sally out from the gates to join the slaughter. They waited for the trumpets. But the trumpets didn't sound. Days passed. The imperial army sat on the hill of Montmartre, idle. The horses grazed. The soldiers cooked their meals. Down by the river, the Vikings stood in their shield walls, waiting for the attack that never came. Inside the emperor's tent, a different kind of battle was being fought, a battle of nerve, and Charles was losing it. Charles the Fat was a man haunted by the legacy of his ancestors, but possessing none of their spirit. He looked at the Vikings and didn't see a trapped enemy. He saw a risk. He saw a battle that might cost him men, money, and perhaps his own life. He was a man who believed that the pen was mightier than the sword, mostly because the pen was lighter to lift. Charles didn't want a war. He wanted a solution. And so, while Odo and the people of Paris watched in confused horror, envoys began to move between the imperial camp and the Viking lines. Siegfried, the Viking king, must have been stunned. He knew he was beaten. He knew that if the Franks charged, his army was dead. But he also had the cunning of a wolf. He smelled the fear on the emperor. He realized that the giant army on the hill was led by a dwarf of a man. Siegfried didn't beg for his life. He negotiated. The terms that were finally agreed upon are etched into history as one of the most shameful treaties ever signed by a French monarch. In exchange for lifting the siege and leaving Paris, Emperor Charles agreed to pay the Vikings. Again, he offered them 700 livres of silver, a fortune. But that wasn't the worst part. The gold was bad, but the geography was unforgivable. Charles knew the Vikings were hungry and angry. They had spent a year at Paris with nothing to show for it. If he sent them home empty-handed, they might come back. So, he offered them a consolation prize. "Go east," he essentially told them. "The passage is free." Charles gave the Vikings permission to sail further up the Seine, past Paris, into the region of Burgundy. His reasoning was brutally cynical. Burgundy was currently in revolt against his rule. By unleashing the Vikings on the Burgundians, he could punish his rebellious subjects and get rid of the Northmen at the same time. 2 birds, 1 stone. It was a masterstroke of Machiavellian politics. It was also an act of supreme cowardice. When the news of the treaty reached the city, the silence broke. But it wasn't broken by cheers. It was broken by a howl of betrayal. Count Odo stood before the emperor's messengers, trembling with rage. His people had eaten leather. They had died of dysentery. They had watched their families burn. They had held the door shut against the monsters for a year. And now their emperor, the man they had bled for, was paying the monsters and inviting them into the house? The betrayal at Montmartre shattered the bond between the king and his people. The feudal contract is simple. I give you my loyalty, you give me protection. Charles had failed his half of the bargain. The final scene of the siege is a moment of pure, stubborn defiance that defines the spirit of Paris. The treaty stated that the Vikings were allowed to pass Paris to get to Burgundy. To do that, they needed to sail past the city. But the bridges, or what was left of them, were still blocking the way. The Vikings asked the Parisians to open the river gates and let them through, as the emperor had commanded. Count Odo looked at the emperor's order. Then he looked at the Vikings. He said no. "The emperor may have sold his honor," Odo reportedly declared, "but Paris has not sold hers." The Parisians manned the walls. They refused to lower the chains. They refused to open the gates. They defied a direct order from their own emperor, essentially committing treason to maintain their dignity. The Vikings, clutching their treaty and their bags of silver, were forced to do something humiliating. Because Odo wouldn't let them pass on the river, they had to drag their ships out of the water. Imagine the sight. The fearsome Viking army, watched by the jeering skeleton crew of Paris, had to physically haul their longships overland, rolling them on logs through the mud, dragging them around the city walls to relaunch them on the other side. It was a symbolic victory for Odo. He had forced the enemy to walk in the mud while he stood on the stone. the Vikings re-entered the water upstream and sailed off to ravage Burgundy, just as Charles had planned. The smoke of burning Burgundian villages soon drifted back towards Paris, a grim reminder of the price of their safety. Charles the Fat eventually withdrew his army, satisfied with his diplomatic success. He returned to Germany, believing he had managed the crisis. He didn't realize that he had just signed his own political death warrant. The siege of Paris was technically over. The Vikings were gone. The city still stood. But the world had changed. The people of West Francia had seen the truth. They saw that the old blood of Charlemagne had grown thin and watery. And they saw that a new blood was rising, the blood of Odo, the man who stayed when the emperor wouldn't, fighting. The siege was the crucible that melted down the old order. The Carolingian dynasty had died on the hill of Montmartre, suffocated by its own cowardice. And from the ashes of the siege, a new dynasty was ready to be born. The Vikings had failed to take the city, but they had successfully destroyed the empire. The ships had vanished. The smoke from Burgundy was fading. But the silence that settled over Paris in late 886 was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a calm before a new political storm. The siege of Paris was over, but the history of Europe had been rewritten on the banks of the Seine. We often look at battles as isolated events, points on a timeline where people fought and died. But some battles are architects. They design the future. The defence of Paris was one of those moments. It acted as a sledgehammer that shattered the brittle remains of the old world and laid the foundations for the nations we recognise today. The immediate casualty of the siege was not a soldier, but an emperor. Charles the Fat had marched an army of thousands to Paris, only to pay a bribe and run away. He thought he had bought peace. In reality, he had bought his own demise. News of his cowardice at Montmartre spread like wildfire across the fractured empire. The illusion of Carolingian power, which had held Europe together since Charlemagne, evaporated. The nobles of the empire looked at Charles and realized that a crown does not make a king. They were tired of being led by a man who treated warfare like an accounting error. Just 1 year later, in 887, Charles the Fat was deposed by his own nephew. He died shortly after, penniless and abandoned, a pathetic footnote in the history of the dynasty he had ruined. With his death, the Frankish Empire shattered into pieces. East Francia, Germany, West Francia, France, and Italy, never to be reunited again. But if the siege destroyed an emperor, it created a king. Count Odo, the Lion of Paris, had become a living legend. He was the man who had stayed. He was the man who had eaten leather with his soldiers. He was the man who had defied the Vikings and his own emperor to save the city. In 888, following the collapse of the central government, the nobles of the West did something revolutionary. For centuries, the right to rule was based on blood. You had to be a Carolingian. You had to be descended from Charlemagne. But the nobles looked at the sacred blood and saw only weakness. Then they looked at Odo, a man with no royal blood but a heart of iron, and they saw strength. In a landmark decision, the nobles elected Odo as the king of the Franks. This was a seismic shift. It was the triumph of merit over birthright. It marked the beginning of the end for the Carolingians and the rise of the Robertian family, the ancestors of the Capetians, the dynasty that would eventually build modern France and rule it for nearly 1,000 years. Every French king from Hugh Capet to Louis XVI owes a debt to the walls of Paris in 885. And what of the Vikings? What of the architects of the floating towers? Siegfried and Rollo had failed to take the city, yes, but they had learned a valuable lesson. They learned that the Franks were divided. They learned that the land was rich. And most importantly, Rollo learnt that he liked the neighbourhood. Siegfried fades from history not long after, dying in battle as befitted a Viking warlord. But Rollo was playing the long game. He realized that the life of a raider had a ceiling. You can only steal so much silver before you run out of places to hide it. He wanted what the Franks had: stability. He wanted land. In 911, a few decades after the siege, Rollo returned. But this time, the negotiation was different. The new Frankish king, Charles the Simple, a posthumous son of the old line, realized he couldn't defeat Rollo, so he made him an offer that changed the world. "Protect us," the king said. "Become the guardian of the river, and I will give you the land." Rollo agreed. He was baptized as a Christian, took the name Robert, and was granted the territory at the mouth of the Seine. It was the land of the Northmen. We call it Normandy. The irony is staggering. The Vikings, who had spent a century burning Frankish churches and sieging Frankish cities, became the Franks' greatest defenders. They traded their longships for horses. They traded their hammers for lances. The Norse raiders evolved into the Norman knights, the most feared heavy cavalry in the medieval world. And the lineage of the siege continues. A direct descendant of Rollo, the man who tried to break into Paris, would one day launch an invasion of his own. His name was William the Conqueror. In 1066, the Normans would cross the Channel and conquer England. So, in a strange twist of fate, the British monarchy today traces its bloodline back to the Viking warlord who stood outside the walls of Paris, staring up at Count Odo. When you walk through Paris today, it is hard to imagine the floating towers and the fire ships. The Ile de la Cité is dominated by the Notre Dame Cathedral and the Prefecture of Police. The wooden bridges are gone, replaced by stone and steel. The mud is covered by cobblestones. But if you stand on the Pont Neuf and look down at the dark water of the Seine, you are looking at a graveyard of empires. The siege of Paris in 885 was not just a battle for a city, it was a battle for the soul of a civilization. It was the moment when Western Europe realized that it could not rely on distant emperors to save it. It had to save itself. It gave birth to feudalism, the system where local lords protected local people because the king was too far away. It gave birth to the French monarchy. It gave birth to the Duchy of Normandy. The Vikings came to destroy Paris. They failed. But in their failure, they forged the steel that would build the future of Europe. They brought the apocalypse to the Seine, but the Parisians just built higher walls. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most pivotal sieges in Viking history, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community of history nerds. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new upload as we uncover the secrets of the past. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think was the true turning point of the siege? Was it the devastating fire ships, the tragic death of the bishop, or the emperor's ultimate betrayal? Leave a comment below, and let's get the discussion started.